Um, what most people use, as far as the Ellen White method of planting trees, is not Ellen White's method of planting trees. It's her grandson Herbert White's method of planting trees. So what's the difference? You can go back and read what she said. She doesn't put any depth on the hole, and she doesn't specify any specific amendments. And I think that's deliberate, because different circumstances are going to warrant different. Is that? Yeah, that's kind of drop. We'll see how it goes. We're not having good luck with any of that. We think the others, maybe there's a signal drop. That's why we're getting it coming out and everything. So Herbert White, her grandson, and he didn't get this from her. Based on everything that we can gather, he didn't get this information from her. The depth of the hole was decided by asking several orchardists, how deep should you dig a hole in preparation for new trees? And some of them said 2 feet, some of them said 3, some of them said 4. So he just took the average of 3. And so that's what most people use today is 3 foot. But she just said to dig a deep cavity. And the other thing is, okay, we're going to try. We'll try a different one. And so then also added on to that were very specific amendments, soft rock phosphate, a lot of times liming material, and then also a certain amount of compost and everything. Now you have to remember, in her time when she said to dress it, most people were using compost and manure as their fertility elements. They weren't using individual amendments on their soils. Now liming materials were used at that point in time. The dilemma with putting specifics on it is, if let's say you use that soft rock phosphate when you're filling your hole and everything. I have an experience in Australia with a orchard who used the Ellen White method, or what they thought was the Ellen White method, which is actually the Herbert White method, to plant their trees, and their land was a rock phosphate ore body. So when they put more rock phosphate in their holes, 50% of their trees died the first year. Because it wasn't appropriate to put that material on. And if you go on YouTube, you'll find all kinds of Ellen White method YouTubes, and they add even other amendments, different amendments for you to use. My advice is, yes, the deep cavity is valuable, but I also say that sometimes you can dig that deep cavity and the soil around it will not drain. This happened at Agra a few years back in Texas, where they were going to do an example of it and dug the hole, and then we got really heavy rain and the hole filled with water and it never drained because the soil was so tight that the water would eventually go out. But we have some soil like that on our property in Kentucky where we were going to put an orchard, and I dug the holes, and we got rain and they filled up with water, and months would go by before that water would drain out of there. We had a fragipan, what's called a fragipan there. Really hard, really tight soil. And so if you were to dig that hole and you were to do all the amendments into it while it was dry, and you planted the tree there, or a bush, you said blueberry, and it rained really hard, that cavity would fill up with water. And because you dug so deep, if it was shallow, it wouldn't be so hard? Well, when it was shallow, it was still pretty hard. It was still pretty tight soil, but it would have, the top surface, a lot of the water, some water would soak in. If it rained hard, then the water would run off because it couldn't infiltrate very fast, and it couldn't infiltrate very far very fast. So we had to do some emergency measures on those trees there in Australia to try to get them recovered, which was a lot of foliar feeding of the trees because they couldn't get the nutrients. I told you that phosphorus and calcium are the heavy hitters in the soil, and when you get too much of them there, they tie everything else up. And so if you're going to use that method, I think you really need to understand the soil that you're working with. I think that's the deliberate reason why she didn't really give specifics on that. I don't know if she would have anyway. Yeah. So knowing what those conditions are, then you have to look and say, okay, well, what do I need to do to try to alleviate that? In some cases, it's really hard to do, and you might need to consider a different location. But one of the things you can do, like in our situation, or even in that situation, is you can pull a subsoiling plow through that, dropping calcium down into the channel as you do that. So it'll start flocculating the soil and putting channels into it, trying to use plants. You could work that soil, till the soil, but it's going to, if you don't change the conditions, it's going to go back to what it was before you tilled it. But you give the opportunity to grow something if you open that and loosen that soil up by tilling it. So I always encourage people to know what you're dealing with, know what the condition of your soil is before you approach doing that. It works really well, even the Herbert White method, which is what Lynn Hoag uses most of the time. And I know Lynn, and he does a lot of really good work. But like most of us, we don't really like to launder our failures. And so usually what you see is the things that worked out the best, but you don't always see the things that didn't work out so well on it. And so there's virtue to what she said. Understanding what she meant is important. Did you have a comment about it?
I just wanted to say we planted multiple trees when we thought we were calling Ellen White method, and then we just looked up what Ellen White herself said and tried to just follow that, and that was actually the tree that did the best. Yeah, man. And it was a lot less work, I'm sure. It was just different because, like, yeah. Anyways.
Okay, did everybody hear that comment? Okay. There are circumstances, like I said, where the Herbert White method, that people call the Ellen White method, works really well for those types of soils, but there's also circumstances where it doesn't do so well. So, okay, did that answer your question? Okay. All right, we have an hour, and I have about 4 or 5 hours worth of material left. Do you want me to? Well, I can finish the different nutrients, or we can jump to. I think probably we should just go ahead and jump to external influences and cover that briefly, and then see how much of the biology and carbon fertility we can get in. Okay, sorry. I need to go to the other one. Okay, so on those other nutrients we didn't cover, like I said, you can get the PDF for that or the PowerPoint if you want it. You just won't get any additional explanation from it. I'm going to put some cards up here. I'll put what cards I have here. So if anybody wants one, so if they want to get a hold of me for any reason, it comes down to the very last card, and there's only one card there. If you could just take a picture of it, so that if anybody else wants the information, they can get it. So far we've been talking about the soil, but in any growing system, you have two components to it. You have the soil, and then you have the environmental or external influences. And what I primarily mean by that is the weather. And depending where you are, your weather is going to be different than other people's, but in general, most people have the same types of phenomena in their weather. It's just some are more extreme than others, or things like that. But the biggest thing we're going to talk about here is water. But we're going to go through just briefly here a few things that you want to consider. And you can't always do anything about them, but many times you can. And so modifying the climate so that the system works better, there's lots of ways of doing that. I will tell you, I have run very expensive greenhouses that were year-round, and it's very expensive to operate, and you'll find out that working year-round 12 months out of the year without stopping It is not a 9 to 5 job. We just decided that wasn't, we couldn't continue to do that. So we've gone now, I've changed my mind. When I was younger and full of energy and everything like that, I thought these sophisticated operations, which they can be, but they can be beneficial. But there's a lot of things you can do that are simple things to do that can enhance your growing system and help you to be more productive with it. And I've migrated quite a ways back towards that from the very expensive and sophisticated stuff. Okay, so what are those influences? Well, weather, like I said, is one of them, and then light levels, temperature, moisture, wind, pressure, atmospheric pressure. We'll look at those each briefly. Contaminants. One of the things that wasn't mentioned when we were talking about buying a property was, what is upstream from you? Upwind and upstream. Because I do know people who have bought property and discovered after the fact that there was industry upstream from them that was polluting the air and the water that they were depending on being able to use. And the industry wasn't going anywhere. So we'll look at that briefly for a little bit in there. And then vectors. So what's going to be brought by the environmental conditions that you're in, what's going to be brought to your property that you may not want there? Okay, so the first thing we want to look at is light. I talked about this a little bit, I think, where in Colorado, where we lived at 7,000 feet in elevation, we had 300 days of sunshine, and in the summertime, we were getting 10,000 foot candles of light. And that's how they measure light levels. And plants only need 3,000 to 4,000. And so that light level was actually too much. And in fact, in the greenhouse that we had, the plants grew much better because that light level was reduced and dispersed as opposed to growing outside. So we had raspberries, for example, and not the one that I illustrated, that extra one, but inside the raspberries would grow about 5 to 6 feet tall. Most of them were about 6 feet tall. And in our outside garden, we had raspberries as well. And those raspberries were only 4, maybe 5 feet tall. Because of the solar intensity, the plant had to do put a lot more energy into cooling itself, because the radiant light, direct light rays will heat the plant up. And then the plant has to cool itself. Whereas in the greenhouse, for example, the light was dispersed. Part of it was blocked, reflected, and then the rest of it was dispersed. And so it didn't all hit directly onto the plant leaves, and so it would help it to stay cooler on that. So a lot of people think, well, how could you possibly have too much light? Now, where we live in Kentucky now, we have much more cloud cover. We're at a lot lower elevation. And so we have a lot closer to the 3,000 to 4,000 foot candles of light. So our problem if we try to grow in a high tunnel or greenhouse there is making sure that we have enough light. Because the same thing happens. You block part of the light and you disperse it. Dispersing it's not a problem. But blocking the light and reducing the light levels, then the plants are not getting enough light. But just so you understand that you come from a lot of you guys from this area, and so you have similar weather patterns. But some people are going to come from, where was the fellow? He was high in the mountains. I think it was 1,800 meters, so that's pretty high. He's going to have a lot more light, solar intensity at that elevation than you would have here, or where I have in Kentucky. That has to be taken into consideration. And it's a stressor on the plant. And whenever you stress the plant, that means that plant has to put energy and resources towards addressing that stress and trying to reduce that stress level. The effects on the soil, solar intensity on the soil, I shared with you a little bit about this with you as well already, about that experiment in Texas that showed if you have something growing on your soil, it'll help keep your soil cooler. Where the soil's bare and you have nothing on there, and the sunlight is hitting it, it's going to cause that temperature to rise significantly in the soil, and that's going to adversely affect the microbes in the soil. They're not going to want to function. They're going to shut down. Did I mention the recommended cover? Well, if you're growing a garden, it's going to be the produce you're growing. But one of the things you'd want to do is to make sure that you space your crops so that they have the space that they need, but there's not a whole lot of space between them, so that when they grow up and they start canopying the soil, that shades the soil too. Because like if you have a lettuce plant, and once it's little like this when you put it in, but then once it grows and spreads out, then it covers a wider area of the soil. And so you can shade the soil that way. You can interseed, which if we get the time to get to it, we will, where you can plant crops in between your produce crops to help not only with fertility, but also to help shade the soil and protect it. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time. You kind of get the idea about the light. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time if I can avoid it on some of these. Okay, temperature. Most plants will shut down once the temperature gets up about 80, 85 degrees. They'll start the process of shutting down photosynthesis because it's too warm for them. Now, this is the leaf temperature. It's not the air temperature. So it's what the leaf of the plant is feeling, the temperature is. And so if you're growing a crop, I tend to, and I think I have some pictures in here, I tend to grow as many things up as I can. Because if the plant's growing up, the only part of the plant, and I put them close enough together so that they're getting enough light, but the whole plant is not being impacted by that solar, particularly the solar radiation that's hitting the leaves, the direct sunlight that's hitting the leaves, so that we can keep that temperature down. Now, the better the fertility and the healthier the plant is, the higher the temperature it can handle. And the other thing that happens when it does get that hot, which sometimes you can't avoid, is the plant is built reserves, energy reserves, into its tissue. And so if it has to shut down photosynthesis, and it has to go into photorespiration where it has to start burning energy to maintain the functions of the plant, it has the surplus energy. What you don't want it to do is start breaking the plant down and producing, like I'd said, ammonium nitrogen, where you start inviting insect pressure and everything as a result of that. If that does happen, I don't remember if I said it or mentioned it or not, but if it does happen, you can actually use some molasses or even like powdered sugar and foliar apply it to the plant and give it the energy from that, and that will help it to use that energy so that it doesn't have to to reconstruct those proteins for one thing, but also to help prevent it from having to go into photorespiration and start breaking the plant down if it doesn't have adequate energy. I don't, off the top of my head, it varies. It's not a lot. You don't have to use a whole lot. Yeah, it would be plenty on it. Yeah, you dissolve it, you just put it in water, dissolve it in water, and then spray it on the plant. And then the plant will take that energy in through the leaves and utilize that energy, since it's not photosynthesizing, because it'll use that energy that you put on there to burn, to maintain its functions on it. Okay, and of course temperature. These things are kind of connected together. They don't function independently. So light levels and temperature kind of go together, and so they kind of overlap and everything. But again, like I said, on the soil, you want to avoid soil temperatures from elevating. If we get to it, we should get to it here. We're going to get into the whole climate change idea thing, and I'm going to show you what it actually is, and not what people tell you it is. But anyway, everything is about moderation and balance. So keeping the temperatures as moderated as you can. Now, some plants like more heat than others do. If you grow watermelons, they like a lot of heat. If you grow okra, anybody grow okra up here? Okay, you do? Okay, yeah. I grew okra in Colorado, and everybody looked like I had lost my mind. It wasn't one of the culinary preferences. Yeah. I think I have a picture of growing sweet potato vines up in the air. Anybody grow sweet potatoes here? Do you? Okay. Good. You'll appreciate this picture then when we get to it. Okay. So I put this slide in here just to show you that the ability to build organic matter in soils is related to the weather. And so the cooler the temperatures, the more organic matter you can build in your soil. And the more rainfall, the more organic matter you can build. And so if you follow where you guys are, you're in a really good place to build organic matter because you have cooler temperatures and you have rainfall. You have a good amount of rainfall. If you go the opposite direction, you get down to the southwestern U.S., they cannot build organic matter there at all. It's just whatever organic matter is produced from the growth of crops and everything is burnt out fairly quickly because they can't get a lot of vegetative growth because they don't have the rainfall and it's really hot. And so, a lot of energy takes a lot of energy and so it gets burnt out. So this just weather affects that. And so a lot of times people say, well, you ought to be able to do this down here. And you say, well, even where I am, it's a challenge. We have hotter temperatures. We have rainfall, but we have a lot warmer temperatures. And so we can burn through organic matter in a hurry too. It's just that it's much harder when you get out into where it's even drier. Like out in Colorado when we lived there, it was hard to build organic matter. Now you can do a better job of that if you actually employ good soil fertility practices and good agricultural practices of keeping your soil covered and getting maximum growth. And actually building what we'll hopefully maybe get a little bit to is the liquid carbon highway. Okay, well, we were just mentioning moisture a little bit too. Moisture levels, if there's too much moisture, then plant roots can have a hard time getting adequate oxygen if you don't have well-structured soil. This is the reason you want to have well-structured soil, because if you do, any excess water is going to move on through and clear the area where your primary roots are that are going after nutrition, after nutrients and everything. If you don't have enough moisture, well, then they're going to be stressed as a result of not having enough moisture to transpire. And the plants have to transpire in order to pull nutrients in from their roots. And if they can't transpire, they're not able to pull adequate nutrients. And now, that's not completely true. There are other methods that plants use with microbes to get nutrition. And plants can actually get moisture if they have a good microbial relationship. In other words, if they have good fungal and bacterial populations in the soil that they've created a symbiotic relationship with. If it gets really dry, and we're going to see this when we get to water. Maybe I better save that comment until I get to water, because it'll make more sense there. Okay, so the effect on plants is their ability to transpire and adequately function. If they can't transpire, they can't photosynthesize, because they need moisture actually in the photosynthetic process, as well as being able to transpire to cool themselves, just like we sweat to cool ourselves when in warm weather. Now, if you're in warm weather and you have high humidity and you sweat, it doesn't always work real well to sweat, because the moisture levels in the atmosphere are high enough that you can't get rapid evaporation. When we lived in Colorado, we hardly ever went swimming unless it was a heated swimming pool, because we had very low humidity there, and it could be 90 degrees outside. And you would jump into a pool, or if the kids were playing, or if I was doing something with the water, or the kids were doing something in the water, if they would spray with the hose and everything, it would flash evaporate off you, and you would be freezing cold even in 90-degree temperatures from the rapid evaporation of that moisture off your body. So the plants feel the same thing. So if you're in a hot, dry climate and you're sprinkle irrigating, you're using sprinklers to irrigate your crop and everything, and when that water hits those plants, it's going to flash evaporate. It's going to pull a lot of heat out of those plants. Now, if you needed to do that, that's good. But if it pulls too much heat out of those plants, then the plant has to put more energy towards warming itself back up. When I was at Eden Valley, you couldn't grow melons there because it's in a mountain valley, or they said you couldn't grow melons there. It was in a mountain valley, cold air coming off the mountains, and in a high desert climate like that, you lose heat at night fairly easily. Well, I love growing melons. I think I said that once or twice already. And So I was determined to figure a way I could grow melons in that climate. And so I just went about figuring out, okay, what's the problem? Well, if I use sprinkler irrigation on them, that's going to overcool them, and they're not going to get enough heat gain to really grow well. And if I lose heat at night all the time, then I'm not going to get enough heat gain that way for the melons. They need a lot of heat to grow really well. And so what I simply did is I put what's called an IRT mulch on the soil. It's a green or brown plastic mulch on the soil. And it allows the infrared spectrum of light to go through, but it doesn't allow the visible light spectrum to go through. So it doesn't allow weeds to grow underneath it. Nothing can grow underneath it because it blocks the visible light spectrum. But the infrared goes through and it warms the soil. And so with the plastic there, it would hold that heat in there a lot better. And then I put drip irrigation under that. It's in a black tube with the solar intensity we had in a black tube, and then underneath that plastic, it would warm the water up pretty good, so I wasn't putting cold water on those melon plants. And then we hooped the beds early in the season, and we would put floating row cover over those plants to help, again, hold the heat in that was gained during the day, because we would get really warm during the day. We had rapid solar heat gain from the sun. We always got wind in the afternoon, too, because that heat gain so rapid, it would cause expansion of the atmosphere and then cause wind. We also had to avoid that too, all that wind later in the day, because that would start cooling the plants off too, which we'll look at here in a second. And by doing all of those things, I was able to get melons to come in about a month earlier than they would otherwise. And so we were able to grow melons, great melons. They grow great melons at Eden Valley still as a result of those things on it. But this is one of those illustrations of modifying the climate that you have to achieve an objective with a crop that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get to mature and produce a really good melon, or in this particular case. So moisture in the soil, the same thing with that. You remember that pie chart, we want about half of that soil as pore space, and then we want half of that space filled with water. If you fill it all with water, what do you lose? You lose air. It pushes air out of the soil. Now, if you have good structure and the excess water moves through, what happens when that water moves through the soil? Yeah, it pulls air in with it, behind it. It pulls fresh air in behind it when it comes in on it. So you want the structure so that you have what's called field capacity as often as you can, and we're going to look at that in just a second when we get to actually water. But you don't want saturated soil. You don't want water where it's just sitting there full of water, because then the soil can't breathe, the microbes can't function, your plant roots can't breathe either, and that causes all kinds of problems for you. It's just another stress on the plants for whatever time period that you have to deal with it. That if you can avoid it, you want to avoid it. And all these things may only make a little difference, each one of them, but when you add them all together, it makes a significant difference. So that you have, like in your case, whoever lives up in this area where you have a shorter season, every day, the more heat gain you can get, and every day of growing time you can get as a result of that, the better, because you don't have a really long growing season to take advantage of. Okay. Water vapor is 97% of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. CO2, which is the big one you hear about all the time, but you also hear about, along with methane, nitrous oxide, ozone, and a few other gases, equal about 0.04% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That is not what's causing the problem. 0.04% of those gases, that's all of them, not just CO2, is not what's causing the problem. It's the way the hydrological cycle is functioning. This is just a picture of the water cycle. Water is not staying long enough in the soil. Not enough water is being captured in the soil, and a lot of agricultural practices, you hear all kinds of things about what they're going to do to correct this problem, but most of the problem is with agriculture. Most of the problem is with poor soil conditions. And if those soil conditions were corrected in different agricultural practices where you kept soils covered rather than and something growing on them as much as possible, the little bit of heat gain that we're getting, that they're measuring right now, it would be easily eliminated with all of that. And we'll get into why in a little while, but I just wanted to put that in there, is that CO2 is critical, and we may get to that. We'll probably get to that when we get to the carbon fertility part. We're at about 350 to 400 parts per million right now. Plants start dying at 180, I think it is. So we're not very far off where all plant life starts dying because there's inadequate CO2. And most commercial greenhouses inject CO2 and raise it to about 1,000 to 1,200 parts per million. And they get fantastic growth at that level. And another issue with trying to sequester carbon the way they're trying to do it is that the ocean has so much CO2 dissolved in it that it would take 1,000 years to overcome what the ocean would release to replace whatever we take out. So it's not that what they're saying is a solution is not the solution. It's more competent agricultural practices and soil fertility practices, which will sequester that carbon where it's supposed to be, creating a sponge which will hold more water, and more water will buffer temperature, and it'll stabilize the weather. And that's the problem, is the weather is unstable. Not that the weather climate changes all the time. And the more unstable it becomes, because we destroy the buffers that stabilize it, the more unstable it's going to be. And so you're going to bounce from one extreme to the other, like we saw and I shared about in California. I'm sorry? Chemtrails? Yeah, we better not deviate off on that subject, but it's one of those harebrained ideas where we're going to block the sunlight to reduce the temperature. I mean, they're really pushing that out in public now. They've been doing it for a while, but anyway, most of man's solutions to just about everything winds up being disasters for life. That's all I can say about it.
So it's not a conspiracy? No.
Well, this is being recorded, so I don't know what I should say. Yeah, we can talk about it privately. Okay, so here's that pie chart I was just talking about, where you want about 25% of that airspace, or half of that airspace, it's 25% of the total volume, to be filled with water. And you don't want it'll fluctuate a little bit there. It can go up a little bit and go down a little bit, but in general, that's about what you want, half of that airspace filled with water. You want pore sizes or pore space in that soil that'll allow for some of them to have water, be completely filled with water, and then others to have just a film of water, and the rest of it just be filled with air. But that's what you want to shoot for. And a lot of people believe that you can't do this, but you can do it, and people are doing it, and is developing soil structures that allow for this to actually happen. Okay, so a big issue, like I said, is the water in your growing system. And that water is coming from somewhere. It could be coming from underground. It'd be coming from rainwater. You could have drilled a well. You might have a pond where you're capturing rainwater. You could have a domestic source of water, of treated water and everything. But that water is actually coming into your soil system from outside. Some water may be in the soil, but it came there from somewhere else. It wasn't in the soil already. So we need to look at some of the dynamics of water in the system, and one of them is infiltration. What you want is your soil to be able to, when it rains, you want that rain to be able to go into the soil, not puddle on the soil and run off, but you want it to be actually to go into the soil and through the soil, whatever's more than you need, to go deeper into the soil, into a reservoir where that water can actually be capitalized on later by bringing it back up to the surface again. You also want to look at the storability and the availability of the water, which we're going to look at in a couple other slides here. Capillarity is the ability of water to move in the soil, to move up and down, and to move side by side. And we'll in the next couple of slides we'll look at that too. And then another dynamic is evapotranspiration. you really don't want water evaporating if you can avoid it. Now, you're not going to stop that completely, but your goal should be to minimize how much water evaporates. And the more you're in an environment where you don't get as much water, when we lived in Colorado, we only got 15 inches of rain, 12 to 15 inches of rain a year, which is not very much. And so we needed to make sure, and remember I said we had that low humidity environment? So what water wanted to do when it fell is it wanted to evaporate back out. In fact, in February, I was out at Eden Valley, and I was doing some classes there for them and everything. We were going to go out to show them how to pull soil samples. And we literally had a blizzard there while I was there. But it was the next day, and the sun was shining again and everything. And a lot of the snow had already melted because of the sunshine and the low humidity. And we went out to do the sampling and everything. And it turns out that almost none of that water was penetrating the soil. As it melted, it was just evaporating. It wasn't infiltrating. Almost all of it was going back to the into the air because of, like I said, the soil. And this was in February. It was cold, but the sun was shining, and so it felt warm because in a low humidity environment that you can feel pretty warm and everything. But this is a big problem when you get into that type of climate where your humidity levels are low and your solar intensity is high, is that water, when you do receive the water, you really want to have good ability for it to infiltrate, because if it sits on the surface for very long, it's going to wind up going back to the air and you're going to lose it. You want to be able to transpire it to the air. You want productive growth in your plants from that water being transpired through the plant into the air. You want any of it to evaporate. Now, if you're in a climate where you get plenty of rain and everything like that, evaporation is not as big of a deal. But a lot of people live in climates like that where they have low humidity and high solar intensity, and water becomes a more precious thing to them, and making sure that they take advantage of it. So having something growing on the soil allows for better infiltration. Having a mulch on the soil allows for better infiltration and reduces the amount of evaporation that'll happen from that soil. Let's go to some of these slides because it'll. Okay, we have this jar up here it'll tell you what soil type or soil texture is. So if you have a really sandy, this is the drainage pattern by soil type. This is typically what you'll see happen. Is in a sandy soil, a really looser soil, more open soil, the water's going to spread a little bit, but it's going to go straight down. It's not going to spread very far. In a more loamy soil, where you have a more silt and clay in that soil, you'll get a wider pattern where it'll want to spread a little bit more as it's going down. And then if you have a heavy soil, a more clayey soil, it's going to spread quite a bit more than it is going to go down because of the structure, the type of soil, the texture of soil. Now, after saying that, you can change this pattern. You change the pattern by changing the structure of that soil. You're not going to completely change it. You're not going to make a sandy soil infiltrate water like a clay soil does. But you could bring a sandy soil more to what a loamy soil is like, and you could bring the clay soil to more what a loamy soil is like, is where you get a better spread pattern and infiltration pattern on the soil just by improving the structure of that soil. You don't want water just to run through and not stick around enough to benefit your growing crop. Okay, so this slide here is available water for plant growth. Not all water in a soil is available for plant growth. And if you look on here, we have what's called hydroscopic water, capillary water, and gravitational water. Hydroscopic water is the remaining water that adheres to soil particles and is unavailable to plants. There's a thin film of water on there, and it's a lot of water that's still in that soil. And the soil type, again, the soil texture, will determine how much of that hydroscopic water there actually is. And they show this line as a wilting point. When the moisture levels in the soil get to that point, plants can't pull the water out of the soil anymore. but microbes can. So this is where it's important to have good biological activity in your soil and a relationship with that biology, because bacteria and fungi can pull that water off when plants can't get it off. And if the plant has a symbiotic relationship with like a mycorrhizal fungi, the bacteria and the fungi will pull that water and bring it to the plant. And you remember, well, I'm trying to think of this, it's a different one, where a guy who was growing blue corn, an organic blue corn for, making blue corn products, had his highest yields in a year when they had when they had a drought. And it was because he had developed this this mycorrhizal relationship with the fungi in the soil and the bacteria and everything. And because they had so much sunshine, because they didn't have rainfall, it gave the plant a lot more energy, and the water was tapped from this hydroscopic water by the microbes in the soil and given to the plant, because those microbes depended on that plant for their energy. So if that plant died, they died with it. And so they were helping the plant to provide it with the water. What you want in a soil is water that's called capillary water. It's water that's held in micropores, and so even in a well-structured soil, you have different sized pores in that soil, but you have a balance of the right size of pores. And so water will be held in micropores between these aggregates of soil particles. It'll also be held, as you see in this picture, it'll be held around them. There's always a charge, some degree of a charge, and it attracts the water to it, and you'll get this film of water around the soil particles. But in some places, it doesn't really show real well on this one. You'll see air spaces between a lot of these. In some cases, the pore space will be small enough that it'll be all filled with water. And in those spaces, you'll have anaerobic bacteria functioning, fixing nitrogen and other things that have to be fixed in the absence of oxygen. So you want those smaller pore spaces there. And this water is the water that is available for plant roots, and they could absorb it. Gravitational water is like when it rains, and assuming the water infiltrates and doesn't run off, is water that'll go down through the soil and be, just continue on out of the top zone of the soil. It drains out of the root zone. And field capacity is the other term here, is the line between capillary water and gravitational water. Capillary water at field capacity is the maximum amount of water that you can hold in the soil. And gravitational water is just going to keep on going, and you're going to lose it. Now, I had mentioned a carbon sponge and how water is not being held in the soil. Humus in the soil, organic matter, which we'll get to, so I'll only briefly mention it here, or hopefully we'll get to it. Probably won't. Is organic matter, humus, stable organic matter, or humus. Every 1% of humus in your soil can hold an inch of rain. And then actually, the more humus you get in your soil, it's actually a little bit more than an inch of rain. So if you had 5% humus in your soil, it could hold about 6 inches of rain. And if you needed an inch of water a week, how long could you go without rain and the plants still grow? Well, if you had 5 or 6 inches of water held in that humus that could be given back to the plants, you could easily go a month and a half without any rain. Most soils don't have anywhere near that amount of humus. I'm suspecting up here you probably have quite a bit more than most places do because of the climate and everything. But agricultural soils will be lucky if they have 1%. Most of the commercial agricultural soils will be lucky if they have 1%. And what this does is that water buffers temperature, because water can absorb a lot of heat. So another thing that it can do is if you have the water in the soil and you get radiant heat penetrating the soil, well, the water's going to absorb that heat and it'll give it off at night. So if you're trying to get better growth and a longer season and everything, this is another way that you get a longer season. The better your humus levels in the soil, the more water it's going to hold, and as heat is generated, that water can absorb it and give it off later. It's also, like I said, it buffers the temperature, and this is where we have a problem, is our temperatures, going all over the place anymore, as we don't have adequate moisture in spaces where it can do that buffering. But vegetation is a moisture sink. It attracts moisture. So the more vegetation you can have growing, the more the likelihood you're going to attract moisture, and the more moisture you attract, the more buffering capacity you have to moderate temperatures. So this is what's broken, and we have these extremes in temperature and weather and everything because of the loss of this what they call a carbon sponge, or even the ability of the soil to structure itself. Soil has become so compacted and everything because of poor chemistry that you can't hold this water in the soil anymore. Most of it runs off rather than infiltrating. Or if it's too loose, then it's infiltrated and goes into the groundwater, and you don't really get the benefit from it in the long haul. Okay, so I talked about water quality earlier here. You really need to know the quality of the water that you're using if you're going to use it. You really need to know it for your own benefit, your own health benefit if you're consuming the water. But for your plants, if you're growing a garden and you need to water with a water source, you need to know what the condition of that water is. And I didn't think that until just it's been about 15 years ago. I didn't even pay attention to water until I had to. And then I discovered that, a lot of water has a lot of issues that need to be considered and addressed if you're going to utilize it to grow crops. And a lot of times it creates problems for you growing your crops, and they don't perform well, even if you're actually trying to do proper fertility. So they have to be addressed. And some of these characteristics are what's called TDS, or total dissolved solids, and it's the mineral load in the soil. And the higher that is, the more of a problem it becomes. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these. Soluble salts are salts in the soil, not just sodium chloride, but any salts, like it could be calcium sulfate, potassium sulfate. It could be some of the different nitrogen fertilizers. The higher the salt level in there, they say you want a minimum soluble salt load because that gives electrical conductivity to the soil. That's what the EC means, electrical conductivity and everything. But my experience has shown that you don't need very much electrical conductivity at all. You don't want a whole lot of soluble salts in your soil really at all. You want it held so it's available, but it's not soluble, and allow the plant roots and the microbes to actually access it that way rather than have it soluble salts. If you have too many, we're going to look at the next slide that's going to show you what too many is, and I'll tell you a story there. Then plants can't get water. They can't pull water against the gradient of those salts dissolved in the water. They can't get the water out of the soil. And what happens when that happens is your plants die because they can't get nutrition. They can't get the moisture and they can't get nutrition. We'll look at that one in just a second with a slide here. Bicarbonates is another material that can come in your water, and bicarbonates can tie up alkaline elements, and in particular it's going to tie up calcium. In fact, what it does is it converts calcium back into limestone, back into calcium carbonate and everything. But usually it comes with other cations like sodium. And that next one down there, SAR, is sodium absorption ratio. It's a calculation you have to do based on how much calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium you have in your water. And if that SAR measurement is above 3, you got problems. And what's simply happening is you've got sodium and bicarbonates coming in with the water. The bicarbonate is taking your calcium off of those colloids and converting it back into calcium carbonate, and the sodium is taking its place. And you remember what I said about what sodium does to soil structure? It collapses it. It disperses your soil colloids, and it collapses your soil structure. So that's a measure that you really have to be aware of. If you have those issues, hopefully you don't, but you really need to know if you do. Contaminants and pollutants. This could be all kinds of things. This could be organisms. It could be chemicals, things like that. If some sources, like the water that our domestic water comes from. And we don't irrigate with the domestic water, and we filter the water we use to drink and everything. But we discovered that there's high levels of chromium and cadmium in the water source that they're treating this water from that goes into the domestic water supply. There's also radioactivity in that water. So being mindful of what is actually in the water that might be causing problems. PHC is a measure of whether or not the water is going to deposit minerals in your soil or it's going to strip them. And so knowing that, there is water that's is in essence too clean, and it'll actually strip minerals out of your soil and leach them out. And then there's water that has got a high TDS or a high mineral load, and it'll actually deposit these minerals. And the question is, do you want those minerals or not? And over time, you're going to find out you didn't want them, because it's going to continue to put things in, even though you have plenty of it and you don't want any more. This is a irrigation water test that was done. I had a place, I had been working with them. They decided they wanted to do something different. And then a couple years later, they called me back and said, we planted our high tunnel 3 times, and every time everything died. Do you know what's happening? I said, well, we need to pull a soil test and we'll see. So I went over there to pull a soil test, and the guy that was managing the farm at that point in time said, do you think the water could be a problem? And I said, why do you ask? And he said, well, maybe you should taste the water we're using to irrigate in here. So we ran the water for about 5 minutes and tasted the water, and it was so salty I had to spit it out. It almost made me want to throw up. It was just that salty. This is that irrigation water test. And in 2 years, irrigating with that, they had put, on a per acre basis, they had put 5,000 pounds of sodium into this high tunnel and 6,000 pounds of chloride. That's table salt. And they should have only had about 50 pounds of sodium and about 25 pounds of chloride in that soil. 50 pounds maybe would be okay. And everything. In other words, the salt level in that soil was so high that nothing could grow. It just couldn't get water. And it was tying up all kinds of nutrients and everything. You see all those red bars there. What were they again? Because I don't remember. Magnesium was too high. Calcium was too high. Sodium was too high. Chloride was too high. Bicarbonate was too high. Any of these orange bars. Potassium. Conductivity was way too high. Of course, that EC, because they had so many salts in the system. Total dissolved salts was out the off the chart. And sodium absorption ratio, which remember I said if you're above 3, that was, I can't read that very well. Can I read it over there? It was high. Let's just put it that way. It was ridiculously high. And so nothing would grow. And it was the water. It didn't have anything to do with the soil fertility that had been done there. In fact, it ruined the soil fertility there using that irrigation water on it. And so we're still trying to figure that one out. We've taken the cover off the high tunnel so it can rain in there to leach. It's a lot of sodium chloride, so between the two of them, they'll leach each other out. So we had to just put inches and feet of water through that soil to leach out that sodium and chloride out of that water. And we're still working on trying to get that back so that it'll grow anything. We're close. We're down to 500 pounds of sodium for 5,000, but that's still 10 times too much. That's in the soil. So knowing what water you're working with, hopefully you have good water that you can work with. And in some of these circumstances, some of them could be high and they could be workable. You can do something about it. And especially, this happened in their high tunnel. It didn't happen outside because they weren't irrigating outside. They were using rainwater for outside. So it only happened inside because they were irrigating from that well and they had no idea, what was coming in with that water. And this is a situation where this is not fixable. They have to come up with a different water source, and they're still working on what they're going to do for that. But they wanted to replant. I said, it's not where it needs to be yet. And I said, you don't have another water source yet. They don't have a water source yet. So if we put a cover on that high tunnel and they want to plant in there, I could have done things to help the plants to grow well. But they didn't have an irrigation source, and if you're covering it, you have to water it. So you have to get water from somewhere, and they didn't have it yet. But
So if these things are too high, and the soil, you have the soil that probably needs those things, put the water in place what's lacking in the soil.
that's what we're having to do. And in fact, in this soil, they had too much calcium there beforehand. This is because this is one of those situations where somebody couldn't use uh, you couldn't use too much soft rock phosphate, so there's excessive phosphorus levels here. And one of the interesting things that happened, and we discovered when I took a soil test after it's leached quite a bit, is that now the trace elements are just ridiculously high. They're all way too high. So it's going to take a little bit of work to get this all worked back to where it needs to be. Well, they had to get the calcium level back up. The pH was too low, and we had to get the calcium level back up. But I don't think the calcium level is too high, so we were needing to bring it down anyway. So I think we're going to wind up with all those being too high anyway. But there's nothing you could do at this point except you can raise the calcium level a little bit higher than you normally would to try to offset that a little bit. But everything else has to come up, and those trace elements are not going anywhere anytime soon. Once you get trace elements up to where they need to be, you'll probably never touch them again for 20, 30, 40 years. So something we're going to have to work with there. This is the water that I use. It's just pond water, rainwater that's collected in a pond. And they consider a lot of the things in there low. Now, this is a situation where the pHC on this water, I don't think they did a pHC on this. They generally only do it if it's gonna be depositing minerals in your soil. They didn't do a pHC on this, but this water could potentially strip stuff out of my soil, and so I have to be mindful of that and keep up on the mineralization of my soil to make sure that it doesn't. But I would much rather have this situation than have the other one, because this I can work with. This a grower can work with. Okay, wind can just dry plants out. It can cool plants. Like if a plant is getting a lot of wind in a low humidity environment, it's going to cool the plants off quite a bit. And so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it. It can dry the plant out too, so it has to transpire more than it otherwise would. So if you're in a situation where you don't have a lot of moisture, you really have to pay attention to the moisture levels when it's that dry to make sure that the plant can stay adequately hydrated if you have high winds. If you don't have winds, one of the things that wind actually does that's beneficial, if it's just like a breeze or something, is it'll actually bring CO2 into the plant canopy. When plants are transpiring during the day and they're pulling CO2 in, remember that in the very beginning there where we did the photosynthesis thing, the plants are pulling in CO2 to photosynthesize with. They can deplete the plant canopy by the middle of the day of CO2. They can pull in all the CO2 and it's not migrating in fast enough at the levels that we have now. And so they'll shut down photosynthesis. That's another reason they'll shut down photosynthesis, is because they don't have enough CO2. The same can be true for water. If there's not adequate water, they'll have to shut down photosynthesis because they don't have the water for the process either. So having some wind can be helpful because it'll bring fresh air into the plant canopy, bringing fresh levels of CO2 in it. An advantage of having mulch on the soil, we haven't got to that yet, and I don't know how much we're going to get to, but can actually, once that breaks down, it releases CO2, and CO2 is heavy, and so it works its way up into the plant canopy slowly. So that's another source of CO2 where you can increase the CO2 levels in your plant canopy, which helps with increased photosynthesis and growth on your plants. Not enough wind, and air can get stagnant in the canopy, like I was just saying, and can become a problem. Atmospheric pressure, I think I'll just skip this one because it wouldn't be real significant. Well, basically it comes down to this. We lived at 7,000 feet in elevation. The atmospheric pressure was a lot lower. The air was thinner as a result. And so the plants could deplete CO2 in the air much quicker because of that. If you're down at a lower elevation, the atmosphere is denser, heavier, there's more air in the canopy and can actually, provide for more CO2 or oxygen, whichever one is being utilized. The plants, believe it or not, are using oxygen up on top too. It's not the plant utilizing it though, it's the microbes on the leaves that are using the oxygen who need it to do what they do on the leaves of the plants. Contaminants we talked a little bit about. you need to be aware of what, if you're buying a property, or if you already have a property, but if you're buying a property especially, be aware of what's upwind and upstream from you. Find out if there's like a landfill or something like that that could potentially be leaching things in the future. Any kind of mining or industry or things like that that could potentially be a contamination that you want to be aware of, so you can make a decision about it. If you already live somewhere, well, then at least you're mindful of what potentially. There was out there where we lived in Colorado, there was a cement plant, and it deposited a huge amount of manganese downwind from it. And as a result, that's where chronic wasting disease. Anybody hear about chronic wasting disease? That manganese was tying up iron and copper and everything, and zinc and everything, the high levels of it. And that's, the deer there had chronic wasting disease because, it's a long story, we won't go into it. But anyway, it was downwind from a cement plant. And there was a lot of manganese being deposited, so there were toxic levels of manganese as a result of that plant. So it could be a lot of different things. That's one in particular there. All right, you just want to be aware of. Contaminants can also be, if you're next to a bigger farm and they're spraying chemicals on their plants. I've had a lot of growers deal with this, where drift from chemical sprays have damaged or killed their plants and everything. So you want to kind of know what's going on around you, as far as any kind of chemicals that might be used in agriculture or otherwise on it. Did you have a question?
Yes, I looked at a house, this was a 5 or 6 years ago, in Halliburton, and there was a lot of radon. Have you heard of radon?
Yeah.
And it's connected with lung disease. And there's uranium gas.
Yeah, she was just commenting about, she looked at a place and had a lot of radon and uranium. I actually had a grower in Montana.
The owner of the house died of lung cancer.
Oh, really?
The house was up for sale, and we didn't know until we got into the house. And in the basement, half of the house was like all rock, and it felt very strange in that house. But
Yeah.
I asked a lot of questions, and found out the owner died of lung cancer. So I was like,
Yeah. So another good question to ask: what might be contaminating the ground there or the rock?
there's a lot of radon.
Yeah, there's a lot of areas where there's a lot of radon coming out of the ground that you want to be either try to mitigate if possible, which there are ways to mitigate that. But I had a grower in Montana who, it turns out, was downstream from a uranium mine, and so the irrigation water that they were utilizing was high in uranium. And it turns out that he was starting to have health problems. And when he went and had his blood tested, he had really high levels of uranium in his blood. And of course, their family had been there for generations and everything, the farming and all that kind of stuff there. But they didn't realize that was having an impact until they started having health issues over that. Okay, vectors. You can't always control this either. I'll give an illustration of a vector. They produced genetically engineered corn, Roundup Ready corn, and people were concerned about, well, what about if the pollen from this corn reaches the foundation stock in Mexico and contaminates it? Well, the people said, well, that won't happen because it's wind pollinated, and so it's never going to make it that far. You know what they forgot about? They forgot about monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies migrated from the Midwest, both here in Canada and in the U.S., migrate down to that part of Mexico. And they carried with them, they vectored with them the pollen from this genetically engineered corn and contaminated the foundation maize stock at source in Mexico. Because, somebody didn't think about the fact that there was more than wind that could vector the pollen and everything. So, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but there are things that can be brought to your property that you may not want brought to your property, and sometimes you can't really control that. Hopefully there isn't on there. But anyway, this ends this one, and it probably ends our time too. Now we have 5 minutes. Let me just switch the... They may have questions while I'm switching this.
Apple cedar rust for apple trees.
Uh-huh.
How do you get rid of that?
You have to get... well, there's 2 ways. A second here. There's 2 ways you have to get rid of your cedar trees. Most people don't want to do that. Or you can improve the fertility in your soil so that the plant is resistant to the cedar rust disease. It's a fungus. And you can raise the fertility of your soils to eliminate that problem with your trees. We have that in our area because we have a lot of cedar trees. And you'll see it all over apple trees all the time where it kind of wipes out the apples. If you don't spray for it, you can spray for it, but increasing the fertility of your soil is the best option for that. Otherwise, you have to just get rid of cedar trees within wind distance of your property, which is not always possible because you don't always own all those cedar trees. You get rid of them. Okay, we'll get through as much as we can here. The biggest thing I want to talk about here is there's a relationship between carbon fertility and biology and soil chemistry and soil structure. Okay? And you want to maximize all of those. There are different ways to provide for carbon fertility. The most common way is number 3 on here, which is biomass, and that's compost, manures, those type of things. But that should be your third choice, your third priority. The first priority you should have is what's called induction. And what I'm saying here is you should have your own testimony. If you want me to put it that way. So what you want to do is you want to improve the conditions in your soil to the point where that plant is producing surplus energy and it is inducing it into the soil. It's dumping it into the soil out its roots, encouraging mycorrhizal fungi, and the mycorrhizal fungi then create a highway through the soil, and it's like the internet too. It's a communication network, it's a transportation network. And then it brings that energy, which is the dumped from the roots of the plant, to bacteria, and it uses it itself, and then those organisms acquire nutrients and water, and they bring it back to the plant in exchange for the energy. That's what you want to establish in your soil. And if you establish that on a almost permanent basis, then you create what's called a liquid carbon highway, where this is where you actually build fertility in your soil, and it's also actually where you build oil in your lamp for a tarrying time. Now, good fertility can do that some too, because it really comes down to the fat content, the oil content, or the lipid content in your plants. The higher the fat content in your plants, the more humus you're going to actually store, the more carbon fertility you're going to build in your soil. So you can have 2 plants growing on the surface, and one is growing really well and one's not. And when they break down, one has high oil content. So instead of 1 to 2% oil content, it has 4, 5, 6% oil content. Well, that much more of that organic matter is going to be broken down into stable humus, as opposed to the other material is not going to be broken down into stable humus. It'll be digested, and the air elements will return to the air, and the earth elements will return to the earth. And I want to touch on that before we have to be done here real quick in just a second. But that should be your number 1 way of building organic matter or carbon in your soil. And it's an energy source. When you talk about carbon, you're talking about an energy source. You want to build energy in your soil. And the next slide we'll go to, I want to show you how you actually build oil in your lamp. But the second way that you want to build carbon fertility in your soil is through green manure and cover cropping. In other words, when you don't have a cash crop growing, and let's say you're in a short growing season, you can't really plant a cover crop in the fall because you don't really have the time. Well, the next best thing is to actually have enough space so that one year you're cover cropping and green manuring that area and you're growing on the other area, and the next year you switch them. So that you have the opportunity to try to keep something growing on that soil or covered all the time. Those mycorrhizal fungi that I talked about, they depend on a live root. They die when the living plant dies. They depend on a living plant and a living root to live. And so you don't get the benefit of that whole process. And we're not going to have the time to get into it. But actually, those mycorrhizal fungi will produce a network, and different plant species will interconnect on that communication network in that highway, and different plants will communicate stresses, they'll communicate needs, they'll communicate availability of this or that or whatever, and they will help each other out via this mycorrhizal network in your soil. But it requires a living soil to do that. You have to keep something growing on that soil and minimally disturb that soil as much as possible to get that. But if you can, to the extent that you can do that, you can significantly increase the fertility of your soil in a short period of time with that process. So green manuring is, we call it a green manure. You're just growing it and you're going to cut it down and till it in, incorporate it into the ground. They have a process now where they call, which they call rolling crimping, where they don't even till it. They don't flail it, chop it up, or till it in. They just roll crimp it, which breaks the stems. They rolls it down, breaks the stems, and then they have equipment now that'll plant through that, just that carpet of green. And then over time it dies down and becomes brown, but you have your soil protected that whole time, and they plant through it. Now, you can't always do that, because if you're growing carrots, you need a clean seed bed to plant carrot seed. It's a little bitty seed and other things where you're going to need it. But to the extent that you can do these things, that's what you should do it towards, knowing what you're able to do. Cover cropping, you can do these things actually when you're growing an actual crop too, by interseeding. Like when we would grow broccoli, for example, or cauliflower. When it got to a certain age, we would go in and we'd seed in red clover, we used white clover because we didn't want it to grow too tall and overshadow the crop. But we would interseed white clover into the rows where the broccoli and cauliflower were growing, and the white clover would grow up, fixing nitrogen. And when we harvested the broccoli and the cauliflower, we would just leave it there to let the clover grow for a while, and eventually we would mow it down and till it in. So there's different ways, different techniques of, if you have a short season, of actually being able to do some cover cropping and green manuring within that. So it's just a matter of knowing, this is a good idea, this is what I need to do to build fertility in my soil. How is it going to work for me with the season that I have and what I'm growing and things like that, and coming up with a plan for it. And then you get down to biomass, which is compost and manures by and large. You have stuff like wood chips where people mulch, or leaves, and a variety of other organic materials that people will utilize. I think on a slide I have, and I don't know we're going to get to it and everything, is, let me see if I can find it real quick here. I don't think it's too far away. Yes, it is. Mowed grass. Yeah, you have to be careful with too green a material, though. You make sure it doesn't get too packed, because it can actually, once the bacteria start breaking it down, it can get really hot and catch fire. So you just have to be careful with that. But yeah, it can be used as well. Sure. Okay, we'll get to that. I'll move to that slide really quick, and we'll talk about biomass. And the bottom line is this: I think it's like 90% of that mass is water, and 90% of it. I'm sorry. Let's see what it's not that percentage. It's a little bit more than that, but 90% is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. All of those elements are going back to the air. That's carbon dioxide and water, by and large, and then the nitrogen, which is going to go back to the air too, if it's not captured in an organic compound in humus. It's going to go back to the air. And so the question is, and 85%, you're going to lose 85% at least of the volume of that organic material. The question is, what are you left with? All of that went back to the air. What stayed was the earth elements, were the mineral elements. The question you have to ask yourself, which mineral elements stayed behind, and which ones did I really need, and which ones were probably not a good idea on it. So when you're making decisions about what biomass you're going to be using, compost, manures, wood chips, leaves, any of those type of things, it's really good to know what you have already, to just figure out, what best is going to work and to what extent will it work before I have to stop, or how do I have to limit that? And then there's extracts and teas. We won't spend a lot of time on that. You can take compost and extract nutrients and signaling compounds, which probably don't have time to get into that, from that, and food sources, and then you take that compost tea, that extract, when I say extract, I jumped to teas. What I was explaining was teas there, and you put that on as a stimulant and as a food source. There's others that are just extracts, which are really not, and an inoculant of the teas are actually an inoculant of fungi and bacteria onto your plants as well and into the soil. Whereas extracts, you're just trying to pull out certain signaling compounds and nutritional compounds, and then applying those to stimulate particular microbial populations on the plant and in the soil. And then we talked about biochar a little bit before, and so I don't think I'll spend a whole lot of time on that right now. This, we'll just do a few more minutes. We're past. Is a few more minutes okay? Yeah. Okay. This is just the process of induction, what's called the liquid carbon pathway. And at the top there it says full capacity photosynthesis. Most crops can produce as much as 3 to 5 times more photosynthetic energy than they typically do. Sugars are released as root exudates. Bacterial populations develop rapidly to utilize these sugars. As bacterial populations develop, they extract minerals from the soil mineral matrix to build their own cells. Plants absorb microbial metabolites and become exceptionally energy efficient, resulting in the development of elevated lipid levels, oil levels in the plant. Lipids are exuded from the roots and are digested by soil fungal populations, which expand rapidly. Fungal digestion of lipids results in the formation of stable humic substances with long half-lives. Stable humus is 40% oil. And this is where you build reserves in the soil, is through surplus energy, through a pressed down and overflowing condition where you actually can build that. If you don't have that condition, you don't have the surplus energy, you're not going to build a surplus to be stored in the soil to be tapped later. Let's see. But that's basically how induction happens, and it's an ongoing process with a lot of parts and everything like that. That's liquid carbon. That's liquid photosynthate there, that drop on the issue there. And then we were going to go through different microbial organisms in the soil. You can get these slides just like the other slides. It's just bacteria and different types of bacteria and archaea, which are similar to bacteria but can handle more extreme conditions. Actinomycetes, they're the ones that, they're decomposers. They're the ones that give soil that earthy smell. When you smell after a rain or something like that, if you're digging soil and it has that really earthy smell, that's when you're smelling them. Facultative and obligate, we won't have time to get into. Basically, what you have organisms that are obligate aerobes, they have to have oxygen to function. And then you have obligate anaerobes, which have to have no oxygen to function. And then you have facultative anaerobes. I forgot an A in there. And these can function in either one. And when you have really healthy soil, these are the most productive organisms in your soil. They can also be pathogenic. A lot of the pathogens we deal with are facultative anaerobes, but it's because they don't have the food source they're supposed to have. If they do, they're not pathogenic. And then anaerobes can they function without oxygen, but they can do it in the presence of oxygen. This is just some more omocetes that are water moles. Phytophthora is one of those that you have phytophthora problems. Fungi, you see the little threads there. That's the hyphae off of the fungi. In this picture here, this is a tree sapling, and there's only 3 actual roots from that tree sapling. They're kind of a yellowish color there. All that other white stuff is a mycorrhizal fungi. Can you see what benefit the plant would have from that? Actually, mycorrhizal fungi increase the access to nutrition and water by plants many, many, many fold. I could talk to people or people told all the time, for example, like when I want them to amend, well, can't I just do the row? I said, no, you really need to do the whole area, because you're not just looking at what the plant roots are going to be able to go after. You're looking at what everything that's in the soil can go after. Same thing's true with tree fruit. A lot of times people will only water or amend underneath the drip line because that's what they're told. You only have to fertilize out to the drip line. But the truth is that tree roots go beyond the drip line, and mycorrhizal fungi go way beyond the drip line and bring things back to the trees, nourishment. Okay, this is mycorrhizal fungi infecting. They call it infecting the plant. Those are mycorrhizal spores. We won't get into all of this. This is just a picture of what I was talking about, where mycorrhizal fungi create this network that interacts and interconnects multiple different types of plants. And there's a multiplied effect of the connection of these plants to cooperate with and help each other in growth. Just more organisms from the soil here. You've all heard about earthworms. You ever see this species of earthworm before? That's a big earthworm, isn't it? Well, you never will see an earthworm that big. This is an optical trick here. I did it this way simply because people make out earthworms to be the savior of everything. And so, they have a gigantic reputation. Earthworms are a very good indicator of soil fertility, and they can make increase nutrient availability, as they say here, and they can improve soil structure, but they can't balance soil. And people say, "Oh, earthworms will fix my soil." They will not fix your soil. So, just some more. Or this is just a soil food web that gives you kind of an idea of how all things happen in there. You'll get this slide. Agreement. There's different approaches and everything: companion planting, interseeding, overseeding, independent seeding. There's some sources here that you guys can get the slide for information on those things. Here's a picture in my high tunnel. This was earlier. It's just an illustration of companion planting, where you can get multiple species in the same ground, taking advantage of the fertility, but also benefiting each other. These are pole beans growing up bamboo here. They're just starting. I have a picture of what they are now. They're all the way up to the top and growing out of the top of the... We have the cover off here because remember I told you I made a mistake, and we've got to leach stuff out of that soil too. And there's spinach down this side and up for halfway, and then the other halfway is beets. And then I think I have the other side. This is carrots going all the way up this side here. I was just using that illustration. This other one is, we had really cold weather this spring, and so our pole beans died 2 times when I planted them because it was too cold for them. Okay, this was the slide. I talked about it already. 80% of plant biomass is water. 97% is made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. 85% of that's going to return to the air and water. What do you end up with? And what else is in it is the questions you need to ask. I'm not discouraging people from using those materials. I'm just saying you need to be aware of what you're using and how it fits with the soil conditions that you have on that. This is just Johnson-Su, a method called Johnson-Su composting that builds those mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. And then you take an extract out of these, which I talked about briefly there. It's biostimulation, signaling compounds, nutrition, or bioinoculation, where you're inoculating with actual organisms like actual bacteria and actual fungi. That's usually the teas that you produce on it. We're going to skip this slide. Skip this slide again. I want you to see this slide. This is called rhizosheath. This is a plant root, and if you look down on the lower parts there, you'll see the actual root. And all of this other stuff on there is aggregated soil that microbes have actually glued together and created a rhizosheath in which they're going to function and grow. That's what you want your roots to look like when you pull them out of the ground. if they don't look like that, then you don't have very good microbial activity in your soil, and you're not getting everything out of it that you could. This I put in here just to point out that there are microbes everywhere. They're not just in the soil. They're on the leaves of the plant. They're on the stems of the plant. They're in the air. They're inside of the plant. There's actually, just like in you and I think I mentioned that for every trillion human cells you have about 10 trillion bacterial cells in your body. And the same is true here when it says endophytic microbiome. That's organisms living within the root, stems, leaves, seeds, and pollen of plants. And so you have microbes everywhere. And the key is you want those microbes. God put them there to help further life. And our ability to steward that, to be aware of it for one thing, and to properly steward it so that all of these organisms are properly fed. And as a result, they're protecting the plant. They're bringing nutrients to the plant. They're communicating. There's a lot of communication that goes on that we're totally unaware of. But I put that, we could talk about that a lot more, but we don't have time. Let's skip that one. Rhizophagy. This is essentially where the plant root takes in bacteria, actually takes them into the plant, takes the nutrients from them, strips their cell wall off of them, and takes the nutrients, and then sends them back out into the soil. And the one big thing, we won't go into a lot of this. This is fairly new knowledge. I mean, it's only been known for about 10 or 15 years that this happens. What I want to get to, I want to see here. This here, the microbes, as they trigger the root hairs on your roots, and they elongate. That's what actually triggers them. Hormones produced by these bacteria in the soil. But the interesting thing is, it wasn't this slide. Maybe I don't have that slide. There's bacteria in carrot root. Anyway, the one thing that these microbes do in the root is they tell it which way's down. A plant root, if you remove these microbes, these bacteria from plant roots, and the seed germinates, and you remove them, the root doesn't know which way to go. And instead of the root going down into the soil by gravity, it'll go, the microbes trigger the gravitropic response in roots. Yeah. The roots will go up, they'll go sideways, they'll go everywhere, but where they're supposed to go, because they don't have the signaling from these microbes in the roots. I just put that, it's fascinating, I just put that in there to point out how important these organisms are. We're going to cover that Friday evening. So, okay. Sorry that was fast, and there was a lot more that we could have covered there, but you can get the slides, and I'll put cards out here if somebody wants them. If you have questions, you want to email me and ask me or whatever, I'm more than happy to help however I can. So we'll end with that. If anybody has some questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But let's go ahead and end. Should go ahead and end. Yeah, we'll just pray, and then if you have questions, I'll answer them. So let's just close with prayer. Father in heaven, we're just thankful that we've had this opportunity to be together. We hope that we've learned a lot and that we're able to bring greater glory to you because we have, and to witness and minister to your children better. And I just pray now as this week is ending and we're coming towards the Sabbath, that you would help us to be prepared, and that we can bring a blessing to you as we know you're going to bring a blessing to us on Sabbath. In Jesus' name, amen.